Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's TN Talks with IPS. My name is Alicia Green, CEO and host of this series. The TN Talks is really our platform used to bring the latest information to our clients and to engage in discussions surrounding hot topics as it relates to business, corporates, governments, and the financial services industry. IPS is a consulting company, pretty much provides a wide array of solutions with a team of experts as we position ourselves as your outsourcing partner in business development, strategy development, digital solutions, general business advisory, and support services. So what we don't have in-house, we do have a close network of affiliates in strategic locations where we engage in business. Feel free to look us up on our website and on our LinkedIn page. But today I have with me to discuss regulation and compliance, a dynamic duo, and what a way to actually end Women's Month. With me, I have Shamini Chase, attorney at law, founder, and the CEO of Gold Leaf Consulting Limited, which is a financial regulator and legal compliance consulting firm here in the BVI. We also have Sherri Ortiz-Fahie. She is the CEO of Sterling Compliance Limited, which is also based in the BVI. Sterling Compliance Limited is a licensed corporate compliance company offering compliance and a wide range of regulatory support services. Although these ladies are in the BVI, their range and reach is across the globe. And what I'd like to do now is give each of them 2 minutes to speak to you a little bit about themselves and their company. And we're going to start with Sherri.
Hi, good morning again, and good morning, everyone. As Alicia says, I am the CEO of Sterling Compliance Limited. We've been providing compliance support services since 2012. I'm the former executive director of the BVI International Finance Center, which is now the BVI Finance. And most recently, I headed up BVI's House of Asia in Hong Kong. So my background straddles both the public and the private sectors for many years, actually. But I come from a compliance background. I was vice president at a US bank in St. Thomas, Virgin Islands. That was my first introduction to compliance. US banks, especially federal banks, are audited and reviewed and inspected, I would say almost every month. But following that, I was actually the compliance manager at Citco. And between the public and private sectors, the work that we do, or the work that I have done and the work that I've been engaged in has always centered around complying with something, complying with some law, and making sure that either myself or the work that I'm producing or the work of the people that are managed by me are involved in meeting some level of regulatory requirement in any business. And my colleague Shamini would speak about that in a few minutes. That's what you do. We get in business and we want to make sure we're doing the right thing. And so compliance becomes a focal point of our work environment. So that's me in a nutshell, and I'm happy to turn over to Shamini Chase.
Please do, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. Thank you, Sherri. So as Alicia mentioned, I'm Shamini. I'm an attorney at law specializing in financial regulatory compliance for about 12 years. Prior to establishing Gold Leaf, which is now a legal services firm focusing on regulatory and corporate commercial solutions. And I'm using that word solutions, which I'll tie in with what Sherri just mentioned. Prior to launching Gold Leaf, I worked for 2 or 3, one as a litigator focusing on financial regulation, and then with an international trust company with its head office in Liechtenstein, where we really focus on a broad ambit of compliance, whether it was for trust companies or banks and fund management. I was always keen because I always was passionate and have been passionate about compliance and guiding persons to find solutions. Many years ago, I would say at least up to a decade ago, persons viewed compliance as really a pain. And I think, as Sherri can agree, what we have been able to do is really help persons understand that compliance is so integral to your business that without compliance and good regulation, it could affect the reputation of your business, it can affect your operations costs, and it can now succumb you to other financing crimes. And also even other fines. So that becomes something very difficult, and businesses then have to face battling that and their reputation. Since launching Gold Leaf, our practice area has really developed from developing regulatory legal solutions to actually drafting licensing applications to a number of global institutions, whether in the fintech space, banks and trust companies. And more recently, what we've observed, a lot of high net worth clients, we now have brought them on to provide family office solutions as their general counsel, where they actually want to have some compliance regulatory person very close to them as they navigate their global business space. So our services have really changed and become dynamic. And more recently, as we've seen in the BVI, it's now include nonprofit organizations and even jewelers and other what we refer to as designated non-financial services business. So we'll touch on this as well in the discussion, how regulation has impacted all of them, and they now need compliance to be able to steer their business in the right direction.
Excellent. Thank you, ladies, for sharing a bit about your businesses and yourselves with the audience. Now, regulation and compliance, yes, it's quite the buzz of today. And some entities we know are adapting well, while others are still having challenges with their processes. So, and I know as consultants, we've identified some gaps, and it's definitely an area that everyone needs to pay attention to, as you mentioned, Shamini. So why don't we get started with just providing an overview of a regulatory compliance?
I'll probably start. There's been significant growth in the compliance space. Sorry, I would say over the last 10 years. This is probably due in part to the expansion of the BVI's regulatory framework. But also, I think there's been a demand for greater compliance focus across the financial services landscape globally. And though compliance is typically seen as a cost, and as Shamini said, to many clients, pain, it has still elevated in significance in recent years. Obviously, the introduction of more and more laws and regulatory requirements has driven the demand for increased compliance performance. But I think as well, it has created a greater appreciation for the application of compliance frameworks. And so we see clients and companies, working to create a stronger compliance culture within their organizations, and to doing the things that are expected and required to, as Shamini suggested, prevent adverse reputational hits and certainly fines or sanctions from regulatory bodies. The supervision of the BVI Financial Services Commission to financial services companies here in the BVI certainly keeps compliance and related activities at the forefront. The FSC has strengthened or widened its reach, so to speak, and is really consistent in staying in touch with its licensed entities, conducting reviews and ensuring, even in the post-pandemic scenario, virtual assessments where they can't do physical assessments. And that sort of signals that there is a consistent need to stay on top of your compliance program. I think in addition, it's been quite a bold move for the FSC to introduce this corporate compliance licensed entity that both Shamini are part of individually. And it has brought even more attention to the importance of compliance. And I think in a way has also strengthened the respect that we have for compliance as an area, and also highlighted the role of the compliance officer and compliance professionals within the financial services arena. A compliance officer, or the role of a compliance officer, is now a go-to job. It's a go-to career. And in addition to the few corporate compliance licensed entities that we have now under the FSC's supervision, there are a lot of compliance consultants in the marketplace, again, all trying to be there to offer not just assistance, but compliance really comes down to problem solving. We understand, we should understand what the law is, what the requirements are for our related businesses, and the essence of compliance is to really determine how I can meet that law within the ambit of my organization, given the resources that I have available to me. When we look at what compliance is, it is really no more than putting in place measures to comply with a set of rules, requirements, or laws. That's what it is. So it starts with understanding what the laws are particular to your licensed entity, particular to your client group, and putting in place a framework to address those requirements and to meet the obligations. That's generally compliance. That for our financial services industry, we have generally most of us have a clear understanding of the path to compliance. It doesn't mean that we're always firmly on that path, but that's where people like Shamini and myself come in to assist.
And just heading off of what Sherri mentioned, I always find a good way to illustrate compliance by demonstrating what can occur with non-compliance. And the image that comes to mind is this movie, The Purge. So similarly, how, in society, civil society, we have rules as individuals, we have rules and regulations we need to comply with, that we can't break certain criminal laws, traffic lights, etc. If in the absence of that, we would have chaos. Similarly, this is what regulation in the various markets that we operate do. So in the financial services market, as Sherri mentioned, we have rules and regulations to ensure that we have investor protection, consumer protection, reducing financing of crime, which can then exacerbate crime and even terrorism, etc. Now, when you now look outside of the financial market, you still have compliance in the health sector, for example, in the hospital and whether it's a private hospital, community hospital, doctors and practitioners, they have their own rules and regulations that they must comply with to also to protect the safety of their patients. In the telecommunications markets as well, you do have compliance as well. And this is here to ensure that you have fair trade and not monopolization of markets. And you even have compliance professionals being developed in each of these industries. So this is something that we've observed for many years, being that if we have rules and regulations that need to be complied with, then you need professionals who can help steer the companies, whether it's the financial services sector or the health sector, or even statutory bodies, to ensure that they are complying with those rules. In the absence of them complying with those rules, it diminishes their product, it diminishes their bottom lines if they're now subjected to fines, if they're now sued by users of the system. And this is where you had compliance professionals developing. You also have the role of a general counsel now developing. I've observed that especially globally and in the BVI, where you now have general counsels in most larger companies, where from a cost perspective it's determined that it's easier to insource it so that you have somebody guiding you in terms of your legal risks from within. As Sherri mentioned as well, with the compliance professionals, we now see them in the C-suite. So they're now in the top tiers because they're seen as such an important role to be alongside your board. Now, this is something that the BVI legislation also requires, that your compliance professional needs to have seniority to be able to direct and guide the board. You can't have somebody rendering advice and they're not given sufficient seniority for that advice to be accepted. And we also develop policies and procedures in an effective way so that the recommendations of a compliance professional can be taken seriously and not just the commercial aspect focused on. So as you'll see, compliance has become really dynamic in the BVI particularly. We now have, and the Financial Investigations Authority in the BVI has now been doing a lot of public service in relation to what we refer to as the DNFBP, so designated non-financial services business, which has been a bit of a headache for quite a few clients who've come forward. These include jewelers, real estate agents, automobile salesmen, all asking, why do we now need, what are we required to comply with? And, when you look at the risk, these types of businesses are heavy cash intense business. And this then makes them more vulnerable to money laundering. As a result of that, because of what we need to remember here, international regulation, yes. And we won't go into the politics of international regulation where you're looking at the OECD, but now just looking at the FATF, the Financial Action Task Force, their mandate is to ensure that they look at all vulnerabilities of new business activities to see whether these can now be utilized by criminals for money laundering and terrorist financing. High cash intense business would fall into this because you're dealing with high levels of cash. So what this means, we now need to have certain policies and procedures to ensure that we know the source of funds of the person who is coming to purchase the item, and that it makes sense. You're dotting all your I's and crossing all your T's. So right now, DNFBPs are now falling within this compliance realm, and we'll discuss this later on. Fintech, virtual assets. This has been well, Bitcoin arose from 2009, but from 2017 onwards, the BVI has really been in this space, and it all centers around how do we regulate and protect this business, not only for the users, but society as a whole. And just to touch on that point, why regulation is important, I always refer to the financial crises back in 2008, 2009. If banks were not properly regulated at the time, now there are more stringent regulations. As a result of that, you had poor capital adequacy. So we had what was called bank runs, where people came and withdrew their money, and that impacted the economy. You had subprime mortgage lending. All of these elements don't just impact the institution, they can actually now seep into society as a whole and affect the jurisdiction. And the jurisdictional impact can have a global impact. So all of this stems and looks at why compliance is so important.
Absolutely. And if I can add, Shamini, I love the fact that you threw in the hospital and even telecoms. Yes. As a matter of fact, our own hospital in the BVI, the Orlando Smith Hospital, Sterling has done some work with them because they required a compliance unit in order to achieve accreditation. And so it spans every area of business in our community and probably every area of our individual professional work and careers.
Ladies, I definitely agree. And again, we can see that this definitely is something to consider from the inception of wanting to start a business or a company. You have to start thinking about implementing some regulatory requirements into your plan, into your policies. So this is great. Why don't we jump into now letting us know what the current regulatory environment looks like?
I think actually by necessity, the regulatory environment in the BVI is forced to shift from time to time just to accommodate and to respond to global changes. So therefore, what we do here in the BVI, primarily the Financial Services Commission, they introduced regulation. They introduced laws not just for products and services, but laws that provide a regulatory framework in response to external pressures, economic and technological developments. We have to stay with the times and with the trends. So in 2015 and maybe leading up to 2017, the focus of regulation coming out of the FSC was primarily responding to demands for transparency. The regulator amended quite a few pieces of existing legislation to strengthen our KYC, know your customer requirements, and also introduced BOSS, the Beneficial Ownership Secure System. So at that time, it was all about knowing who the owner or the controller was or is behind the business. And then there was a shift towards greater fairness in tax matters, which led us to the economic substance legislation, where we still are today. And since then, I think it's been legislation to respond to extraneous demands under the direction of Mr. Ken Baker. What you're seeing is the BVI is shifting to focus, I believe, on strengthening and preparing our financial services industry for sustainability into a more technologically directed future. In 2019, we introduced, or the FSC introduced, amendments to the regulatory code, which really focused on corporate governance standards. And that was followed very closely by new prudential and business reporting, our now loved AML CTF returns, which I think are all due by today. If everyone hasn't gotten those done, today is the deadline. But this shift is all geared towards information gathering and monitoring. And the kind of information that is being gathered puts us in good standing and preparation for the upcoming mutual evaluation, and Shamini will speak a bit more about that, but also prepares us as well for future international reviews. So what we're seeing is again more internal strengthening based on our regulatory introductions. Now the FSC is really focused on shifting to allow an openness for the new digital assets and financial technologies that are available on a global scale. We also are now in a position with our regulatory framework to be at the forefront of these opportunities. And to that end, some new and some not so new legislation which signals our readiness include the Proliferation of Financing Act. And that speaks to, we have the terms, we're so used to the AML-TF, but now there's AML-TF and PF. And proliferation of financing is really financing weapons of war, really. So there's now legislation that we have to be mindful of and has to be spoken to in our written policies and procedures specific to this particular threat. Information security and data protection has also been introduced over the past recent years as requirements that lay out obligations that companies have to fulfill. Digital verification prepares us to just be more open to a virtual online working environment and business relationship. As well, we see that in preparation for our new digital assets legislation that we're hoping to receive sometime later on in this year, even the Proceeds of Criminal Conduct Act has been amended to define cryptocurrency. So I like that the BVI Financial Services is actually not just responding to international demands, but we're moving with the times. We are being prepared and we are laying down a framework where we can not only provide the services, but there are regulations and requirements behind the services and products to ensure that we are conducting our businesses in a way that protects the consumer, as Shamini says, but also meets international standards and provides protection to the reputation of the BVI and the companies and businesses that are doing business here and being and connected with us.
Most definitely.
I think Shamini is going to take that conversation forward a bit more. Sorry, Alicia.
Yes.
And talk about, again, the new Fintech regulations and the regulatory sandbox and all the exciting things that everyone, all the buzzwords that people want to know more about these days.
Go ahead, Shamini, because then after you do this piece, just to let everyone know, we have a quick poll coming up right after this. So you get ready to get involved and let us know what you think about some of what we're discussing. But go ahead, Shamini.
Thank you, Alicia and Sherri. So as Sherri mentioned, with regulation is so important to be dynamic, and both of us operating on a global scale, we can agree that the response of the BVI, the FSC, the government, BVI Finance has always been very leading to deal with what is happening globally, to be innovative. So back in 2017 and 2018, actually, as Sherri mentioned, we had the amendment to the AML code where we looked at e-verification. And this also shows the role of a compliance professional having to continuously be dynamic, because the e-verification allows you to verify your identity using artificial information technology and blockchain. So let's look at our journey, Sherri, probably back in 2009, 2010. In the banking sector, and I'm sure most persons, I can see some bankers on the line, everyone asks a certified copy of your document, and that's stamped with the certification standard. And for those in the BVI, that wording, true copy, a true likeness to the image. And now in 2018, it was realized, but with technology, how can we now make this process still safe, but also reduce on this onerous obligation of the certification standard? We don't want to dilute it so that we now end up with receiving fraudulent documents, but how can we use technology? There is technology out there. And now we're seeing clients and other software service providers that we actually work with who use their selfies and other artificial technology to be able to verify the identities. So a lot of our larger clients, banks and fintech firms are using this sort of technology to be able to do that form of verification. And this is permissible under our legislation within certain requirements. Certification has been lessened, and now we have the BVI Sandbox space. Now, I want to just backtrack to why it's so important for regulation at a governmental level to be very fast moving as well. Back in 2017, I actually had the opportunity to bring the first cryptocurrency exchange to St. Lucia. And Alicia and I started working on it, and this is why she's nodding.
I remember that.
This is 2017. And regrettably, by 2018, we had to migrate them over, re-domicile them to Seychelles. Mm-hmm. Now, the rationale for that was that Seychelles offered a better regulatory environment. Now, this may be surprising where you're seeing participants seeking regulation. But when you're looking at your fintech space and just global international financial institutions, unless your ecosystem is not dependent on correspondent banks or any other traditional financial institutions, you are going to need to have regulation to allow these other partners to deal with you. So unfortunately, 2017, we had our first opportunity dealing with a crypto firm and actually seeing the advancement of the technology and how they use technology to do verification of individuals and entities. But again, we lost that opportunity to another jurisdiction. Thankfully, the BVI was very much on the heels of this, and then we now have our BVI Sandbox space, which is a very innovative and brilliant concept. We were able to successfully steer the first participant that was approved back in April 2021, and we've really been on the road with a lot of other potential candidates who invite us into their companies to sit with them to see how do we now get our product and our services in line with what the BVI requirements are, so that we can get into a sandbox and eventually also perhaps get licensed. So there is that need, there's that desire they have recognized to want to comply with international regulatory standards. And BVI's regulatory standards are international regulatory standards.
Absolutely, absolutely. Shamini, if I can just join in there with regards to the sandbox, I think there's even a local, and when I say a local entity or a company, I'm talking someone not strictly speaking in the financial services industry, but someone who's just a local BVI lender interested in this space, who has, I believe, made application through the sandbox to actually engage in a regulatory fintech opportunity.
And that's awesome.
And that's the whole, and that is the goal of fintech, financial inclusion, that we should all have access to this. And we're seeing more persons, who actually now want to, whilst we're in the BVI, thankfully through BVI companies and the transactions, we're exposed to virtual assets and digital assets. Regrettably, we're not seeing this throughout the rest of the region, but hopefully with fintech, we will see more of this. I know the ECCB did do a pilot study, that's the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank, did do a pilot study in relation to the EC dollar, but all of this is evolving. Now, the BVI, in addition to the sandbox, and what it allows the fact that, first of all, let's be honest, fintech is very complex. I've spent many, many hours meeting with clients where they literally sit down and break it down in dummy versions, but you have version 1, 2, 3 of blockchain and subversions coming up all the time. All of these new innovative ideas, anything new brings risks and vulnerabilities.
That's right.
Why this sandbox is a brilliant concept. It allows the regulator to allow these participants, subject to them passing the criteria, to come in within a regulated space. It allows the regulator, through their reporting, to understand the business, understand what the risks are, and then the intention, in my view, I think with the virtual assets legislation coming out, we'll now be able to design adequate procedures that is still commercially pragmatic. Because one of the things with regulation, you don't want to over-regulate and then you stifle. You stifle the space, you stifle the product, you stifle your competitive advantage. So I believe the BVI sandbox space is a brilliant segue between moving institutions and entities from an unregulated space into what I call a quasi-regulated space. So they too become familiar with regulation before hopefully now upgrading to a full license. Now, with these clients, when we said this first applicant, we've had different experiences. We have, with this client and a few other clients, their regulatory standards, they do comply with BVI requirements from the onset. BVI, for example, may have some variations compared to international standards where ours is a bit more stringent. For example, beneficial owner identification is 10%, and there's a requirement for us to update our due diligence periodically, and we have time frames under our legislation. Some jurisdictions, you don't have that requirement. So it's working with the clients to see how do we now upgrade your procedures in a still, again, a commercially pragmatic way without affecting the customer experience to comply with regulation. Thankfully, for most of these clients, there is, again, that desire to regulate because they understand not having a good compliance policy or procedure would not only affect your regulatory application, it can affect your other relationships. If you have a banking partner who now you have an operating account of your banking partner to pay your staff salaries for your exchange, that is going to be affected if you now become a hit on WorldCheck or WorldCheck compliance because you onboarded a client who did not fit the right profile, who may have had a conviction for money laundering, etc. So people are forced to understand, they've been stifled into understanding why compliance is important. We do have other clients where, and I'm sure Sherri can also express her feelings on this, where we still have to go through these steps of explaining why is compliance important? Why do you need to identify anybody? Because again, they're coming from an unregulated space. But my greatest joy and passion is actually when we're able to take them and change their mindset from why there's a need for compliance to actually designing a policy and procedure that they can apply that does not affect their bottom line. In some instances, we've actually helped clients generate revenue utilizing compliance.
Exactly.
And that's been, and for certain boards, this now becomes the first selling point.
Absolutely, because if it's a high risk situation, or if the portfolio is high risk, generally you can actually charge clients for the extra time and due diligence that has to go into managing that type of client.
Exactly. So with each client, you learn how to navigate in terms of how do you pitch the right adequate compliance process and procedure. So now just going back to the sandbox. And I know this is in our next segment where we're looking at the virtual assets legislation, because what we want to really just touch on is the complexities of the fintech space. As you can imagine, fintech, you have so many global participants and everybody has their own regulatory mapping becomes an issue. Which jurisdictions can you provide services to? Certain jurisdictions are very crypto adverse, which means you cannot by any means, you cannot market your services or have clients from that jurisdiction on your platform. It's now required us to look at, well, you have clients who now avoid this using their VPNs. And even then you have VPN trackings and other tracing, and you have the emergence of new subspecialties within not just the fintech arena, but the enforcement body to trace the assets and using the IP address to actually now trace all of the various crypto assets on the platform. So you have so many subspecialties that are coming in. Even with our FIA and the BVI, I'm aware they're doing a lot of training just on being able to trace property that's virtual assets. So previously, what would be confiscated is real assets, cash in the bank, boats. And now we have to upskill and the regulators themselves as to how do we trace these crypto assets on an exchange, etc. And as Sherri mentioned, this is why you had the Proceeds of Criminal Conduct Act being upgraded, as I call it, so that we can now include virtual assets as criminal property that can be seized. So there are a lot of developments globally in this fintech space. Certain jurisdictions are, very pro this fintech and crypto assets. We've seen Switzerland, we've seen Japan, the US, not so much. A lot will succumb, it's global pressure. We also have to remember there's the political elements. Heavy banking jurisdictions will not be particularly crypto friendly because financial inclusion is really trying to remove it away from the traditional banking system. Regionally, we have seen Bahamas has already passed their digital assets legislation. But again, one of the brilliant features for me with the BVI Sandbox space, especially on the heels of a mutual evaluation where we need to see how the FATF is going to test virtual assets, it allows us to create this little sandbox where we can be aware of the new innovative technology. And we're seeing some potential participants wanting to utilize this technology locally in the BVI. And then it also allows us to see how we can regulate it. So, the sandbox has really been, I would say, for me personally, one of the most novel concepts in this era for the BVI.
I'm sitting here between you two ladies and just feeling the excitement and I'm seeing the passion, that you're giving to this area. I remember when, compliance work started out, everyone was dreading it. They didn't want to do it, but now here we are, and I'm seeing this passion coming from you. So
it's an extremely dynamic, passionate space, trust me.
Yes. So what I want to do now is just put a quick poll out. So here's your chance, audience, to participate with us. Let me know, ladies, if you guys can see the poll. Just take about a minute and go through, answer the questions. The first one, of course, is do you have a compliance rule in your organization? The second question would be, do you collect KYC on the users of the platform exchange? And you can start populating your answers anytime now.
And while this is happening, Alicia, I'd like to just follow up on something that Shamini mentioned, the importance of having written policies and procedures. Normally we house those in a compliance manual. And it's so critical, not just to sort of check a box for the regulator here in the BVI, but even international entities that we're doing business with. I recognize, as Shamini mentioned, that they need to have such a document, or they need to have anti-money laundering and terrorist financing policies and procedures that they can then illustrate to investors, to banks, so that they can get approvals for even further licensing. And what's being used in the main is the compliance manual, or the AMLTF procedures manual, that we are creating for them right here in the BVI. And that document provides them a foundation to expand their business relationships and their service supports and their resources and investment support across the globe. And I just think it's so interesting that the work that we're doing here, as you say, when compliance started out, we used to dread it. But at this point in time, compliance is such a dynamic space, and we're doing so much. The work that Shamini is involved with the Sandbox, you can hear, the level of exposure that one benefits from with that type of involvement. And it allows us as individual service providers to actually put BVI on the map in so many other places.
Most definitely. Definitely. All right, we have some responses to the first question. Do you have a compliance rule in your organization? 68% said yes. 29 no, and 3% it's outsourced, which is great. Do you collect KYC on the users of the platform exchange? 72% said yes. 28% said no. Are you interested to enter as a Sandbox participant? This is a good one. 38% said yes, 22% no, 41% not sure. So we have to try and convince that 41%.
More information, that's all they need.
Yes. Is the BVI government overregulated? 13% said yes, 88% said no.
That's impressive.
Which category or type of crypto or digital asset product do you offer? 9% said cryptocurrencies, money. And then we had 91% saying none of the above. The other choices were decentralized protocol platforms, asset-backed tokens, and pass-through securities. And I think this is where Shamini's now gonna talk some more about that. But thank you guys for participating.
And I think that last question, the question was framed to say, what do you offer? If the question may have been framed to say, what are you interested in? I think you may have gotten a completely different response.
That is true.
Shamini, I turn over to you.
Yes, thank you. Now, in this last segment, we're going to focus on compliance for cryptocurrencies. And I'm always careful using cryptocurrencies because that falls within the general heading virtual assets. Within virtual assets, you have virtual currencies. So what Sherri and I were discussing just in preparation for this is what is the level of compliance that's expected and our general observations. When we meet with a lot of clients, especially our global clients, where we're sitting in their offices, whether in the UK, in New York, and they are literally putting out regulatory mapping. So this is a very key area when you're thinking of cryptocurrency, if you want to launch an exchange. Or I notice we have quite a few participants who are also attorneys online who may be interested in guiding their clients on launching a crypto exchange. Something that's a very key area right now is regulatory mapping. What does that mean? Again, as I mentioned in the last section, that with cryptocurrencies, your users are global. And if it's illegal in certain jurisdictions, the onus is on you to ensure that you're not providing that service in that jurisdiction. Compliance has changed as well, where even as compliance experts, we're looking at the marketing and solicitation element. Are you as a user marketing and soliciting for that person, to that customer in that jurisdiction? So when we sit with these clients, they're literally whiteboards trying to map out which jurisdictions can we offer those services to. And you have to remember this changes. The BVI a few years ago, depending on how the asset worked, it would require licensing, it would not require licensing. This changes because remember, regulation changes based on government's needs, even in terms of government's needs perhaps to have revenue. So this means what was possibly not permitted one day is now permitted. So that changes your regulatory mapping. Can I now market to this client in this jurisdiction? So you get caught up a lot of the times just trying to figure out how do you ensure certain clients are not onboarded or what we say offboarded. An interesting point would be BVI's market is China. We saw last year China took a position that they are banning fintech, they're banning cryptocurrency. So that meant that a lot of the BVI companies that, remember now, a BVI company, even though incorporated in the BVI, can market its services globally. It now meant that these BVI companies had to go through, if they were providing virtual asset services to Chinese resident clients, they now had to go through a process of offboarding. And this is also where the regulator now becomes involved, because as the regulator of these BVI companies, you now want to ensure that these companies that are your BVI companies are not breaking the laws of another jurisdiction. So you're asking for them to report, have you offboarded those clients? And what do you need to remember when we're offboarding clients, you need to ensure that you're not just tossing them out, but if you're holding funds for them, customer assets, you have properly returned those funds to them. This is all the things that the regulator is looking at. It's not just money laundering, terrorist financing, but you're looking at liquidity controls, asset protection. So these are important elements when you're looking at cryptocurrencies. Are those currencies backed by something that is stable so that we can ensure consumer protection? Is there sufficient liquidity backing that so that if there is a run, customers are not left empty-handed and they are able to actually get a return or adequate return on their investments? Is there professional indemnity insurance? And again, this is showing how the traditional role of compliance, remember compliance is two parts. You have an AML compliance of element, which is checking passports, I'd say verification, are you a hit? And compliance, which is ensuring that you are advising your entity whether it is operating within a good prudential regulatory environment. So this is where your compliance professional is looking at liquidity elements, is sitting with your business team. So your cryptocurrency is looking at your marketing team and your new products to see whether what you are planning to launch will actually work within the BVI legislation. Now, thankfully, I had the opportunity to sit on the virtual assets legislation working committee. And the draft that we've seen so far, again, is one that's very user-friendly. And what the FATF has required for crypto virtual asset service providers is to ensure that you are registered and supervised, and again, that you're monitoring and you know your customers. Immediately, one of the first things that people enjoyed about fintech was the anonymity. Again, what the anonymity allows is that it allows persons now coming in with a veil or a cloak of anonymity, being able to use their assets for illegal means. Now it's required these crypto firms to actually have a compliance procedure, as Sherri mentioned, a compliance manual that helps them identify that they need to be able to ensure they can identify the users who are using their services. Now it's extended even into your information protocols. What sort of IP verification and IP address scrubbing are you doing? Previously, we didn't have that level on the blockchain. We were just paper-based. Now we're looking at your IP element. And as I've mentioned, you now have crypto asset recovery firms, crypto asset recovery lawyers. And most recently in the UK, we met with the transaction monitoring team for one of the leading exchanges. And the level of transaction monitoring has changed from the smurfing of cash. And smurfing, as we know, previously was if you had a bank in a number of jurisdictions, deposit here, deposit here, deposit there, like 500 under the threshold. Now you have smurfing of the crypto assets where different IPs are popping up and they're showing the webs of different locations globally. And because of the nature of fintech, these pop up within seconds. So, you know, the technology has had to really change to be able to ensure that you're able to trace these assets so that you can protect your crypto firm. Now, one of the things with BVI legislation is that it's called a principle. We generally have principles-based legislation, which means that it gives you the overall principle and the minimum standard, and it's up for each entity to determine how they now apply it. So what we're observing from our experience, you have some crypto firms that have some of the highest form of technology, as I've mentioned, using AI technology, where you can become onboarded using your selfie, a smartphone. It takes a picture of your face to ensure that it's not a static picture. It's matching it with biometric data in the background, and using the blockchain technology, because with blockchain, the way the ledgers work, it can't be broken. So that blockchain technology can actually help enforcement because it creates an audit trail. So all of these are elements that some of the bigger firms have. Of course, some persons on the panel who want to start creating new technology, new fintech may not have this element of technology. But again, it's about how do we design your policies and procedures to ensure that you're at least able to identify who your user is going to be, and you're able to verify who your user is going to be. So overall, the fintech space has been a really advanced moving space. Cryptocurrencies have not been able to avoid regulation. Both Sherri and I have been very absorbed dealing with bringing them within that regulated space, but it's really been an exciting journey to see the varying use of technology to comply with their requirements.
Absolutely.
Ladies, this is exciting, but I am cognizant that we are running out of time. So what I'm
Can I wrap up quickly?
Yes,
Can I wrap up quickly on the same
quick wrap up?
Thanks. On the same compliance for crypto. Again, it is an exciting space. It can be a scary space for a lot of people. I always say keep it simple. Sometimes keep it simple, stupid if you have to. Start with and understand the regulatory requirements that apply to the scenario. Even though we don't have the digital assets or the virtual assets legislation out right now, we do have legislation that guides you as to the identification of clients, as to the steps that need to be taken for the prevention of money laundering or other financial crime. So understand the legislation that is there, understand your requirements and apply them. Sometimes we understand things, but we don't always apply it. Assess the level of risk that the particular client scenario poses and put in place mitigation and management measures. What does that mean? It means, again, just like the code tells us, elevate in certain cases to a higher level of approval. That would be senior management, a committee, directors, whatever the case might be, having a regular checks, conducting deeper due diligence, and make sure that that due diligence is effective. It's not just, we are no longer in the environment where we can get by with someone just sending us a copy of a passport. As Shamini says, there are now the biometrics structures and applications where we can actually have that face mapped to determine that is the correct person associated with that particular ID number. And so you have to be more vigilant and do a bit more than just the checkbox exercises that we've been used to in the past. And monitor. You have to keep following up. You have to keep checking. Although you conduct the screenings, we conduct ID screenings, sanction screenings, and the like. One of the biggest failures I see as a compliance professional in communication with clients is they don't monitor sufficiently. And when you don't monitor, everything stays static and you think it's okay, but it's not okay because nothing in life is static.
Mhm.
And especially business, it's moving all the time. People are changing all the time, and they're changing their businesses, changing their location, bringing in new partners, bringing in new investors, switching. It's constant. If you're not monitoring, you have no idea what's going on with your client or your client business activities. And monitoring also helps you to identify deficiencies and satisfy or improve shortcomings. That's my best tip for today.
Excellent. I think that's a very good way for us to close. And you actually used some of my summary, but I just want to reinforce really to everyone that I think we can agree that the regulatory requirements alone is not going to be the status quo, that companies, you're going to need good compliance management. And Sherri talked about monitoring. I do think that is very important also, because if you put something in place, you have to monitor to see how it's going, if you need to tweak certain things or update your policies even as we evolve. And so they have to become part of your business processes. Definitely. Shamini, did you want to say any last words before we close off?
No, I think I'm hoping all the participants really appreciate the importance of compliance.
Yes.
And just to touch on the monitoring, looking at what's happening right now, sanctions. We have been, both Sherri and I, inundated with requests where people again think we're this little remote jurisdiction, but you may have persons who you onboarded, and if you didn't have an automatic database scrubbing, you would not have picked up that certain persons may be on your sanctions list. And it may not be for bad sanctions because of what's happened politically. Now you have to deal with how do we report it? You have persons we're seeing trying to avoid sanctions breaches. So that has become a new area, I would say, in the last month for us. So monitoring through sanctions, continuously dealing with the sanction screening and advising a lot of clients as to how to report certain sanctions and tracing it in terms of sanctions breaches that we're observing within the client base at the moment. So keep monitoring. If you don't have an automatic scrubbing, every time the FSC for BVI entities, and even I see some St. Lucian firms online, anytime you see a new update to a sanctions list, please run that name, run your database against that list. Ensure you timestamp to document you have done it. I always say, unless you have recorded you have done something, you have not done it.
Absolutely.
That is the position the regulator will see. Timestamp, date it, that on this date, this is what you have done. That's my
absolutely
excellent. So we've gotten a lot of good comments. Everyone enjoyed the presentation so far. And what I would say to those of you that are in the compliance role, if you thought that it was a mundane task, now listening to these two ladies, seeing the passion, feeling the excitement, I'm sure that you're inspired and you're encouraged now to go back and be more diligent with what you're doing for your clients. So again, IPS, we were happy to bring this presentation to you because, again, as a consultant, recognizing that it is a very complicated area in some instances, and these two ladies are very qualified to assist you. So if you want to get in contact with them, you can send us a quick email at info@ipsbvi.com. We'll make sure to connect you, or if you know them personally, please feel free to contact them. Again, until next time, thank you for coming to IPS TN Talks, and do have a great Wednesday.